Hello, BS listeners. I'm here midweek, not with an episode, but instead with a brief, or at least I'll try and keep it brief, interlude to talk about something that is relevant for me personally, and also relevant for the behavioral community and for the professional business community at large. And that is gender equity. We recognize that there's an equity issue in our midst, and there has been for a very, very long time. And I think the research and science is quite clear on it. Though we've made strides the last 5-10 years or so, I think we'd all agree there's still a long way to go. And it's tough because of certain hidden psychological quirks that make it a particularly thorny issue in removing certain barriers, creating equal opportunities for all, both men and women. So for the most part, I think we've handled the explicit side, the explicit bias and discrimination well. Of course, I still realize there's still some of this out there, but that part has largely subsided. But what is still very much present, still a social and economic reality that we grapple with, is the implicit forms of sexism and gender inequality. From my own background, social psychologists have termed this covert form of prejudice ambivalent or benevolent sexism. It's also related to symbolic or modern discrimination, sometimes it's called. And unlike its more obvious presentation, these implicit versions are difficult to detect. They fly under the radar, and they sometimes even get passed off as fair, just, and right. Explicit sexism, or the counterpart, explicit racism, is much, much easier to identify and to combat. The implicit versions is a mischievous little bastard, a Trojan horse of psychological subterfuge that sneaks around within and without us really knowing. So anyways, all that ranting to say, I'm afraid I too am guilty of this implicit form of gender bias. Specifically with the expert guests I've had on the show so far for the BS podcast, and it's something I want to address. For me, it's a moment of learning, and maybe it's a moment of learning for you as well, as my listeners. So, if you will bear with me for a couple more minutes, I can explain. When I put together the show, I began reaching out to all the experts in the behavioral community. That included scientists and academics, designers, authors, strategists, marketers, consultants, executives, leaders, etc., etc. I never went in with a mandate, of course, to over-anchor on men, especially white men. But you see, that's what ended up happening anyway. And it was brought to my attention early on, and I even sort of defensively dismissed it. But then I looked at my scheduling spreadsheet for the podcast over the next year or so, or a few months at least. And the math was pretty simple. It added up. I've to date recorded 11 episodes, and only one of those was with a woman, which is actually the most popular episode to date, I should add. And even now, as I look into the future of my 40 or so guests that are scheduled into spring, summer 2020, the proportion is 76% men and 24% women. I'm not comfortable with that uneven split. And so I actually want to go back to something I saw on Matt Wallert on his webpage. And I had Matt on the show earlier, a couple weeks ago. And he was talking about gender equity and equal opportunity for specifically speaking engagements in the behavioral community. So Matt is somebody I really admire and look up to. He says, and I quote, "If you claim to be selecting speakers on merit and still end up with an overrepresentation of white males, you are implicitly saying you believe that white men are simply better than others." So, again, getting back to this explicit versus implicit distinction, most of us wouldn't premeditate and plan to have these uneven representations, and yet that's still what ends up happening. So here I am. I recognize that even as a so-called expert in human behavior, someone who's aware of all these pitfalls of our fragile and faulty psychology, even I am not immune to the implicit bias that lurks in the shadows in the background. As I said, I'm not comfortable with this 75-25 split, and I want to change it. So the women I have coming on the show in the near future, there are some, and then they include Jen Lerner, Aileen Holsworth, Rima Tepper, Mariel Beasley, and Ashley Desnoyers. I've also reached out to a few others, still waiting to hear back, but I am missing what I see as some great opportunities and chances to meet some great and amazing people and to have them on the show. So if you have made it to this point in my long and winding rant and you're still listening, and you are or know a great woman who would love to talk about all the BS in the world, let me know. You can email me at nhbehaviorist@gmail.com. That's the American spelling. Sorry, fellow Canadians, I dropped the U there. Or you can find me at www.thebehaviorist, again, American spelling, to drop me a note. And as always, thanks for all the support. Let's continue to grow the BS community with the brightest and the kindest of all people who are out there. And so I hope you join in the mission that we work together to achieve a true 50-50 split on the show and everywhere else, because I think we'll all be better for it. All right. Well, until next time, stay tuned, and we'll talk again shortly.